Welcome to Tracing Your Family Roots. I'm Janell Blue, and with me today I have my friend and excellent cook, Susan Jeter. We're going to talk about Christmas food today. Before we get started, we want to thank our producers, Sydney Sachs, Bob Perillo, Elizabeth Alanoff, and Abdel Bouafa. Thank you for making this show possible. All right, Christmas is coming, and we have food on our mind.
We sure do.
And we want to talk about the kinds of foods that we had at our Christmas dinners. And so I'll just start out by saying that I grew up in Houston. So we had the traditional things. Maybe in the old days they would have had venison and some of the other meats, but we had turkey and dressing, mashed potatoes, green beans. My grandmother made ambrosia, which is just kind of some fruit that really complements the rest of the food. And of course we had dressing, gravy, that's the best part, and pies. And so that is about as traditional as you can possibly get. Susan, you grew up in South Carolina. Tell me.
I did. Grew up in the low country of South Carolina.
Yeah.
But interestingly enough, my mother was from the Tidewater area of Virginia. That's where she was born and raised. My father was from the low country of South Carolina. He moved to Virginia. They met. They lived there probably for 20 years. Moved to South Carolina, and that's where my younger sister and I were born. So I have sort of a combo of Virginia and South Carolina foods. But the typical, I can't say there was typically turkey. I think it depended on the whim that of my mom. She might have had turkey. She might have had ham. She might have had what was my favorite, roast beef. I called it tasty meat. And so, and mashed potatoes, another favorite, or dressing. We had ambrosia too, and you're right, it complements everything so lovely. But the vegetables we would have would be from my daddy's big garden that would be put away for the winter. So we would have had corn, butter beans, probably green like collards, which I hated at the time, but I like now. Yeah. Green beans, of course, and then sweet potatoes, maybe mashed potatoes too, or both. Country ham with biscuits, either sweet potato biscuits or regular biscuits, or a lovely yeast roll. And for dessert, probably apple or peach pie, or cakes. My mom liked cakes, particularly pound cakes, I think. And that was our typical holiday meal.
I think you had a broader variety of food than we did.
It depends on the whim.
Well, let's take a look at what Virginia Christmas dinners would look like. And let's just start with Mount Vernon. And I'm going to put this menu up on the screen. So this is 1790 Christmas dinner at Mount Vernon here in Virginia. And this is based on the American Heritage Cookbook. So first of all, they had an onion soup called a king soup. So I looked it up to see what a king soup was, and it's got an egg in it. And onion soup typically is more like the French onion soup that you're probably more familiar with. And so you want to leave it up? The next thing was oysters on the half shell, and we're going to talk a lot about oysters today because that is something that was very prevalent in Virginia and actually throughout the United States. Although there were some states that didn't actually have, water where they could get the oysters, but for some reason they were able to get them, and that was a specialty. Broiled salt roe herring, and I admit that I had to look that up. And
that's something that my parents made. Well, they put them in a thing in the basement, a crock in the basement. I did not like salt herring, but they did. They sure did.
And there's many ways to make it. But I guess one of these days I'm going to have to try it. Boiled rockfish, that's reasonable. Roast beef, Yorkshire pudding. Now this is 1790, so these are still some influences from England. And of course, Yorkshire pudding is not really pudding, is it?
No, sad to say.
Mutton chops. I had to think about what is the difference between mutton and lamb, and it's all about age. And for some reason, they don't really talk about lamb. So, roast suckling pig, roast turkey. We're going to talk about turkeys a little bit because that is probably the most iconic of all of the proteins that we serve at Christmas. Cold baked Virginia ham. We'll talk a little bit about the difference between Virginia ham and regular ham. They had lima beans, baked acorn squash, baked celery. That surprised me because I thought celery was just used as a seasoning, like a mirepoix or something, really. And evidently that was a real interesting and coveted kind of vegetable in those days. And so it was treated, maybe it was rare. Now it's just like, nothing. And we probably wouldn't bake it, although you said you...
I have braised it once.
Braised it.
It's okay.
And you never did it again.
Never did it again.
Hominy pudding, okay, what's the difference between hominy and corn? And hominy is basically what masa is made out of, your tortillas. And it is a field corn that's processed with lye. But it was used in those days because, it would preserve it. Candied sweet potatoes, everybody's got some of those. So it goes all the way back to 1790. Cantaloupe pickle, I was surprised that we have cantaloupes in Virginia. I know that they're all over the South, but that was interesting. Spiced peaches and brandy, spiked cranberries are very much local to Virginia. Mincemeat pie, lots of fruit, candied fruit. And in those days, they probably did put some kind of ground meat in it. We don't do that today very much. Apple pie, cherry pie, chess tarts, blancmange, which is just a white pudding that's molded, plums and wine jelly, snowballs, Indian pudding. Indian pudding has molasses and more of the flavors that you would have in pumpkin pie. Great cake, ice cream, plum pudding, fruits, nuts, raisins, port, and Madeira.
Lovely.
So that's a lot of food.
Sure.
But George Washington was a very good host, and people would just come there, sometimes uninvited, and he always entertained them. That's one of the reasons why he was almost out of money by the time he died, because he spent so much money on entertaining. But anyway, that is an early Virginia Christmas menu. And throughout the United States, we would have other Christmas dinner traditions based on where you were located, the economy, the situation, and heritage. But in the aggregate, there are several foods that I mentioned just now that are pretty much universal throughout most of America. So let's just start talking about some of those. And the first one we should talk about is oysters. And as I said earlier, I was really, in researching for this, I was surprised that every menu throughout most of the 18th, 19th century, and maybe into the 20th century, they used oysters in their Christmas dinner, and they did it in all sorts of ways. They fried, we ate fried oysters and raw oysters and put it in gumbo in Houston, but we didn't use it for our Christmas dinner. That was something special. How about you, Susan? Tell me about your oysters.
Oysters are the heart of Low Country cuisine, and some particular things that are very festive are oyster roasts, and but I think mostly in the Low Country they're eaten raw out of the shell. My Aunt Rachel, though, in Virginia, would make oyster stew or oyster pie, which is a scalloped oyster dish. And with the oyster stew, I remember it was lovely and creamy, and I love creamy things.
Yeah.
And you put these little saltine type crackers called oyster crackers. I thought those were the best fun ever. But yes, oysters in South Carolina are, yes, that is South Carolina.
That is South Carolina. And a lot of those southern states too.
Sure.
Yeah. And we have quite a oyster farms in Virginia in the Tidewater area, I know for sure. So there was an excerpt from the 1685 edition of The Accomplished Cook by Robert May. And he has oysters there, and it's in the Kansas Home Cookbook of 1886. Describes, in cities and towns where raw oysters can be had, they are often used as a first course. They should be opened and the shell washed an hour or so before dinner and put in a cold place. When wanted for the table, if one has not proper oyster plates, do you have an oyster plate? Arrange 6 of these shells with an oyster in each on a dessert plate with the narrow part of the shell. Where's your shell? There we go. So that one inward meeting in the center, where 2 or 3 slices of lemon are laid, small crackers are passed, in addition to the bread on the napkin, and the pepper and salt should be within reach. So I see you have an oyster plate.
Here's an oyster plate with the indentations and a spot for the lemon. But oyster plates are mostly in antique shops now, or hanging on someone's wall. There was oyster stew, oyster dressing, cream of oysters, oyster cocktails. But by the 1960s, you saw shrimp, scallops, and crab as appetizer too. But we do love snacking on smoked salmon, don't we?
Yes.
With capers and cream cheese before the big event, and that's the Pacific Northwest influence.
Exactly.
So let me tell you, I would like to read a poem though about oysters, because from the late 1880s to just after World War II, oyster industry had really had its heyday in South Carolina. But this is from one of my favorite cookbooks, Hopping John Low Country Cooking, and this is a quote from the Prince of Tides book by Pat Conroy. But it says,
I think that we have it up on the screen.
It says, to describe our growing up in the low country of South Carolina, I would have to take you to the marsh on a spring day, flush the great blue heron from its silent occupation, scatter marsh hens as we sink to our knees in mud, open an oyster with a pocket knife, and feed it to you from the shell and say, there, taste that. That's the taste of my childhood.
Oh, wow.
So yes, oysters in South Carolina, it was a valuable fishery, and in 1902, oysters were responsible for 45% of the value of all South Carolina fisheries. And from 1900 to 1935, oyster canneries grew in number, employing thousands of workers to process most of the state's oysters to then be shipped to all over the world.
You know, I was just thinking that this is I just quoted a Kansas cookbook. How in the world did they get oysters in Kansas?
Voila.
and my grandmother-in-law is in Oklahoma, and she had brought a oyster dish to the Christmas thing too. I don't know that anybody ate it, but it wasn't like fresh oysters, but she had made some kind of dressing or something. And oyster dressing is a fairly popular thing.
It sure is.
But I don't know if she got those out of a can or how she managed. But anyway, well, so that's kind of the oyster, and you can see that we both love oysters. And nowadays, of course, you know, you can get them in the restaurants all over the place, and they've become so popular, and you can choose how briny you want and lots of choices. But in those days, they probably used the local Tidewater, at least at Mount Vernon. Well, there's one other thing that would be interesting to talk about, and that is peanut soup. And if you've ever been to the Mount Vernon Inn here in Alexandria, it's right almost adjoining the mansion grounds, you have a choice of soups. One of them is peanut soup. They call it peanut soup, but it's like a creamy peanuts. It's very rich and thick, and it's quite good. Peanuts is something that wasn't mentioned in the menu because really peanuts came into fashion a little bit later on in Virginia. But it's definitely something that is represented in this area. And I'm going to tell you later on that it influences the hams that you get because of what the pork eat. But anyway, it is interesting to look back on the history of peanuts. And just like many foods, peanuts were introduced because especially the Spaniards, you know, they would travel all over the world and then they would bring back these different foods. And actually peanuts were in Africa, and when the slaves came, the slave ships came, a lot of the foods that we now eat were introduced there. They were brought over from Africa. And what did you call the peanuts?
They were called goober peas, I think, in the Civil War. I think that might have been what it started, but the nickname was goober peas. I don't know why. I should have looked it up.
Well, in the beginning, they were really just used for food for the animals. And then during World War II, of course, George Washington Carver is considered the father of the peanut industry, and he developed these machines that could process it a lot faster, and so it became much more popular, and especially during the Civil War. It was during the Civil War, and then later in World War I and II. You know, you had a pocket full of peanuts. That was a good protein. And it kept, and so that sort of became popular, and now, I mean, we have all sorts of peanut products, especially peanut butter. Every child is except the ones with peanut allergies.
Sad. You know, and also they had peanut soup, and Colonial Williamsburg was one of on their menu too. And Thomas Jefferson recorded had a yield of 65 hills of peanuts at Monticello.
Oh, well, there you go. So it does date back that far then. Interesting. All right, let's talk turkey. And you know, there were the protein that was on the Christmas table usually was either fowl of some sort, that might be the Christmas goose or the turkey or other forms of fowl, or beef, and you know, the roast, the standing rib roast we have today, or the roast that was mentioned in Mount Vernon, and then some sort of pork, and that usually is in the form of a Virginia ham, actually. So, you know, the goose was used in the early days, but turkeys were around because turkeys were introduced again. The Spaniards, you know, came around. There was a lot of foods that were introduced from other places because there were these wandering people who brought them. And actually, turkey, the wild turkey, the Indians had the wild turkeys.
They did.
Long before the others were introduced, but the wild turkey is a little different taste, and you know, it's gamier. It's probably not as tender as what we eat today, but the bird became, you know, the most appropriate to also give as a Christmas gift. And there's this one thing that said that it's customary for the Potters Guild, which had access to, it was the Poulters Guild, which had access to every form of poultry on the market. At Christmas time, they would give a turkey to their clients. And if you think about A Christmas Carol, and if you've read or seen the movie, you know that Scrooge wanted to find a turkey, and he, at the end, when he finally got to be nice, and he wanted to give that to Bob Cratchit. So that tells you, and the turkeys were introduced originally in England. And so the pilgrims, the English who came over brought the turkey idea with them. And it was a little different from the ones that the Indians had, but it has remained. And one of the reasons that the turkey became popular was because of its size, because the goose, was never quite as big as turkeys can get really large. So it would feed more people. They were also, evidently, they grew into their prime between December and February. So the timing was good to get a nice plump, fresh turkey. The other thing that was interesting was before refrigeration, if you wanted to deliver turkeys to the next town or the next county, the turkey grower would literally walk the turkeys. And I have this vision of how, you drive cattle and they were driving the turkey, and they had to put extra padding on their feet because I guess it was such a long distance and they really weren't made for that kind of walking. And so that's how they delivered the fresh turkey, because there was no refrigeration.
That is so interesting. I never knew that.
And then the Virginia ham. And why is it Virginia ham? I mean, what's the difference between Virginia ham and others? And a lot of it is because the pig, they were eating peanuts and peaches in Virginia. So there's a sweeter flavor to the Virginia ham than, let's say, the Black Forest ham. The Black Forest ham is a little smokier. And the Virginia ham is made from razorback hogs. It's cured and then smoked over apple, hickory, and oak wood fires and aged in a smokehouse. And you said that your grandparents had a smokehouse.
They sure did. And then my father built one too at our house. And I can't describe how wonderful that smokehouse smelled. And I remember seeing the hams hanging there. They did mold, and you'd have to scrub, and they're because they're cured with salt. But yes, there's the smokehouse. I would love to go back and smell that scent one more time.
I have a memory of a smokehouse that my grandparents had, but they were smoking sausage.
Oh, sausage.
And I don't know whether they ever smoked ham or not. Probably, but I have this memory of sausage, and my aunt was telling me that they would also make their own beer, and they would put the beer in the smokehouse, and sometimes the cap would pop off because of all the heat. But anyway, after the Civil War, peanuts became a major crop in Virginia. And then the pigs feasted on those peanuts, and that's why that flavor is a little bit different. And there's some other things about it, the way they smoke it, and you can read about that. But Virginia ham is quite good, I think. Well, now we have sweet potatoes and yams, very popular. And again, that came with probably with some of the ships that were bringing humans and food. And the slaves brought those. They had yams, but those didn't work as well here, and so sweet potatoes were more easily grown here. So and of course, candied sweet potato casserole is in Mount Vernon, and it's still made today in most places. So that is a staple. Cranberries have been here. The Indians had cranberries for over 12,000 years, according to what I read. And they ate them, in every form and fashion. And of course, today we love cranberries because of the complement that it gives to the meat.
It does.
And also the dressing too, I think.
My favorite.
I love it. And you can, we make it all sorts of ways. The cultivation of cranberry in the U.S. started in 1816 in Massachusetts. And it's a lot in the Northwest. I mean, the Northeast, isn't it?
It is.
I think that's where it's grown a lot. And finally, pumpkin pie. And pumpkins, again, were that form of squash sort of thing was popular. It was all the way back into colonial times, and I think that the cookbooks that first introduced pumpkin pie were in the 1790s. So, and it's still a favorite today, not only for Christmas, but of course Thanksgiving too. And the spices, I think, are so good.
And a lovely fall color.
Yeah, and the fall colors. I read this one of my favorite books is about the Dakota Territory, and there was an excerpt in there from. Now, I told you that Christmas dinner could depend on location and opportunity, and Laura Ingalls Wilder, they ate jackrabbit on their Christmas, and I'm sure that was when they first got there, but that was the protein that they had, and I can't even tell you how they might have prepared that, but that was definitely. And then we have this little excerpt from South Carolina. Did you want to tell them about that?
Ah.
The calves' heads. Did you ever have that in South Carolina?
No.
So it says Thanksgiving and Christmas meals involve some sort of cooked bird. A nice cut of beef was just the thing in the 1700s for the wealthy Charleston families. According to Drayton Hall's Wood family fellow Jenna Carlson, calves' heads were often the fare of the 18th century elite in both Low Country and Chesapeake. Carlson reported that the wife of a planter, Harriet Pinkner, included a recipe for dressing a calf's head in her cookbook. It called for placing half of the head in the center of the platter and dressing it with a stewed concoction made with the other half of the head. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap it up. Oh my gosh. Not very yummy, but those were the kinds of things that they ate in those days. And when we think about our ancestors, we have to think about what they might have eaten.
They ate.
So, Susan, thank you so much for joining me today and talking about our favorite topic.
It was lovely talking turkey with you today, Janell. Thank you.
Thank you.